Yes, ma'am. I need a unit over here. I'm at the State National Life Building. I'm across from 3rd in Florida. My wife, she was working late last night, and we tried calling her call. I just came back over here because nobody had heard from me or her sister. And when I came over, my truck is still sitting in the parking lot, but I can't get inside the building. I need a cop over here.
It was supposed to be just another Thursday night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But when the sun came up on February 20th, 2009, the world inside a small downtown office had changed forever. Behind the heavy door of a third-floor law office, investigators walked into a scene that even seasoned detectives struggled to describe. A young defense attorney, Chiquita Tate, only 34 years old, lay brutally stabbed more than 40 times. The office was soaked in blood, papers scattered everywhere, and in her final moments she had grabbed onto something so haunting it froze investigators in their tracks. Strands of long, dark hair clenched tightly in her hand. This wasn't just a murder. It was personal. It was anger, and it would shake Baton Rouge to its core. But the bigger question remained. Who could have done this, and why? In Chapter 10 of the Grim Chapters, we will discuss the events that led to the horrifying murder of Chiquita Tate. Before her name was tied to headlines and courtroom battles, Chiquita Tate was known simply as a woman determined to fight her way out of hardship. She grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, raised in difficult circumstances, her mother struggling with addiction, and her grandfather gave stern warnings about the dangers that could swallow her future. But Chiquita refused to be defined by where she came from. She worked hard, earned her place at Southern University Law Center, and when she sat for the bar exam, she passed on her very first try. For her, the law wasn't just a career, it was a mission, a way to give voice to people who had none. Her drive was visible in everything she did. She wore a tattoo of Lady Justice on her shoulder, a symbol of her belief in fairness even when she defended the unpopular. In the courtroom, she was fierce, sharp, and fearless, earning respect from colleagues and intimidation from opponents. Her sister Danita stood by her side, not just in life but at work, serving as her secretary, a reminder of how close the family bond was. To Baton Rouge, she was more than an attorney. She was a symbol of ambition, proof that determination could rise above struggle. Inside the courtroom, Chiquita was a force that people could not ignore. She spoke with such power and conviction that even the toughest jurors leaned in to hear her every word, and other attorneys, even the seasoned ones, respected the way she carried herself. Criminal defense was not an easy field to step into, yet she walked right into it and claimed her place, taking on cases that many lawyers would never dare to touch. She defended people who lived on the edge, men with reputations for violence who were well known on the streets of Baton Rouge for being tied to shootings and deadly crimes. Just being associated with these people could put a lawyer in harm's way, but Chiquita believed deeply in the right to fair representation. She saw it not only as her job, but as her duty, even when others warned her of the risks. Her name was becoming known in the city. Her career was climbing higher with every case. But there was always a shadow that followed her work. Because when you step into the lives of dangerous men, danger often follows you back out of the courtroom. Away from the courtroom, Chiquita's life seemed to have all the pieces falling into place when she met Greg Harris. At first, he was attentive, charming, and seemed to offer the kind of stability that could balance the chaos of her demanding career. To friends and family, they looked like the perfect couple, a young lawyer rising in her field and a husband standing proudly by her side. But behind that picture was a marriage that was far less steady than it appeared. Arguments began to grow sharper, and over time, the fights turned physical. In 2007, Chiquita herself dialed 911 in fear, telling the dispatcher that Greg was attacking her, and from that moment on, it was clear their relationship was poisoned with violence. She filed charges of domestic abuse against him, though she too briefly faced accusations that were later dropped. Even as she continued to push forward in her career, the cracks in her personal life deepened. By early 2009, Chiquita was ready to take the final step away from Greg. She told her sister she was planning to file for divorce, and had already put down a deposit on a new apartment, proof that she was determined to walk away from a marriage that was breaking her down piece by piece. On the night of February 19, 2009, Chiquita Tate was still at her office working late into the hours, as she often did when a big trial was coming up. The quiet of downtown Baton Rouge would normally have felt safe, but that night her office became the scene of something unthinkable. When investigators arrived the next morning after a concerned colleague found her, the sight that met them was horrifying in every sense. Chiquita was slumped behind her desk, her lifeless body marked with more than 35 stab wounds. The attack had been savage and merciless, the kind of violence that spoke of deep rage rather than chance. Blood covered the walls, the floor, and even the furniture, leaving no doubt that this had been a prolonged struggle. This did not seem to be a robbery gone wrong, and everyone in the room knew it. The sheer brutality of the crime and the overwhelming number of wounds suggested something far more personal than random violence. This was a killing carried out not just to end a life, but to send a message, and it left investigators with the sinking feeling that Chiquita had been murdered by someone who knew her. The news of Chiquita's murder sent shockwaves through her family and the Baton Rouge legal community. Her sister Danita, who also worked as her secretary, was devastated beyond words. She could not forget their last conversations, where Chiquita had spoken about making big changes, about filing for divorce, and about finally stepping into a new chapter of her life. Danita knew her sister had been ready to leave behind the unhappiness she carried at home, and now the cruel twist was that she never got the chance. For those in the courtroom world, the loss was just as heavy. Prosecutor Prem Burns, a seasoned attorney who had long admired Chiquita's energy and determination, was deeply shaken. To Prem, this was not just another murder case on her desk. This was a young lawyer with fire in her spirit who had been taken far too soon. As first responders and investigators pieced together the horror of that night, Chiquita's family and colleagues were left trying to process how a woman who had fought so hard to rise above her beginnings had been cut down in such a brutal way. The grief was sharp, the shock was raw, and even in those early hours, one haunting question stood at the center of it all. Who hated her enough to do this? When detectives first walked through Chiquita's office, they immediately noticed that something about the crime scene did not match the look of a simple robbery. Expensive jewelry had not been touched, her purse was still there, and there were no signs that someone had broken in to steal. The violence, however, was overwhelming, with wound after wound that looked far too personal to come from a thief who only wanted money. It left investigators asking themselves why someone would use so much force if the goal had only been to take valuables. Then came the strange discovery of her Gucci wallet on Gardera Lane, tossed out as if it had been dropped during a street crime. At first glance, it looked like a possible lead, but the more detectives studied the situation, the more it seemed staged, like someone was trying to throw them off course. It felt less like a clue left behind by chance and more like a breadcrumb carefully placed to push attention toward an unknown attacker. Bit by bit, detectives began to suspect that this was not the work of a stranger passing through. The sheer anger in the killing, mixed with a planted distraction, made them think that the killer was someone closer, someone with a reason far deeper than robbery. As the investigation moved forward, the focus turned sharply toward one man, and that man was Greg Harris, Chiquita's husband. At first, Greg seemed cooperative, answering questions and explaining that he had spoken to his wife several times that night. But as detectives pressed for details, his answers began to shift and his timeline felt less certain. It was not just his words that raised suspicion, it was the trail of evidence that began to unfold around him. Inside Greg's car, investigators found a pair of safety glasses, and testing revealed blood on them. When the results came back, the blood was identified as Chiquita's, a discovery that was almost impossible to explain away. On top of that, there were more items of hers inside his car, including belongings she should have had with her in the office, and once again it left detectives asking why her things were traveling with him after her death. When Greg himself was examined, scratches were spotted on his body, the kind of marks that could have come from someone fighting for their life. To add to the suspicion, neighbors reported that he had been scrubbing his home with bleach soon after the murder, which to investigators felt less like normal cleaning and more like a desperate attempt to erase traces of what had happened. All of these small but powerful details started to connect, building a picture of a man who could not quite cover his tracks. The sunglasses, the blood, the scratches, the bleach, each piece on its own was troubling. But together they created a pattern that pointed back to Greg Harris, the man who was supposed to be grieving but who instead appeared to be hiding the truth. As investigators built their case against Greg, there were moments when the story seemed to take confusing turns. One such twist came when evidence revealed that a strand of hair at the scene belonged to a woman, which sparked whispers that maybe another person had been directly involved. To add to the curiosity, a tip even suggested that a woman could have played a role in Chiquita's death, and while this idea seemed far-fetched at first, it did not escape the detective's attention. Chiquita had spent her career defending dangerous clients, and names like the Duhart brothers began to surface, men tied to violent cases who had once asked her for legal help. For a while, people in Baton Rouge wondered if her career had put her in harm's way, or if an old case had come back to haunt her. But as these leads were followed, nothing ever settled into proof. The threads of suspicion dangled in the background, yet compared to the evidence that pointed at Greg, they looked weak and uncertain, like shadows that could not outweigh the solid trail leading back to her husband. When Greg Harris finally went to trial in April of 2011, the courthouse filled with tension, because this was not just another crime. It was the murder of a woman who had been admired as a rising attorney, and people wanted to see if her husband would finally face justice. The prosecution, led by the seasoned and determined lawyer Prem Burns, laid out the story in painstaking detail, showing how the evidence created a picture that Greg could not escape from. Jurors saw the sunglasses that carried Chiquita's blood, found inside Greg's car where they had no reason to be. They were shown photos of the scratches across his back, scratches that matched the shape of her manicured nails, and they heard how a broken nail left at the office crime scene was proven to be hers. On top of that, they were told about the bottle of bleach inside Greg's home that held traces of Chiquita's blood, and they listened to how his stories about his movements kept changing. From denying he was ever on Gardera Lane to claiming he met a steroid supplier who later admitted he had not seen Greg in months. The moment that seemed to leave the strongest mark was when the scratches and the broken nail were shown together. In that instant, it felt as though Chiquita's own struggle was speaking for her, proving that she had fought for her life and left behind the clearest sign of who she had fought against. As the trial moved forward, Greg's defense team knew they had to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, and they did this by pointing the finger in another direction entirely. They reminded everyone that Chiquita was not just any attorney, but a woman who had taken on risky clients, people with violent pasts who might have had their own reasons to harm her. The names that surfaced again and again were the Duhart brothers, men who were tied to criminal activity and once asked for her help in court. The defense built the idea that maybe one of them, especially Denard Duhart, who later ended up dead himself, could have carried out the murder. They even went as far as saying that evidence might have been staged to make Greg look guilty. It was not a story of proof, but it was a story of possibility, and in court, sometimes possibility is enough to sway opinion. After more than 2 weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury finally reached its decision, and when the verdict was read aloud, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Greg Harris was found guilty, but not of second-degree murder, which many had expected. Instead, he was convicted of manslaughter. The word struck like a compromise, a way of saying that he had killed Chiquita, but without the careful planning that prosecutors insisted he had carried out. For Chiquita's family, it was a bittersweet moment. They had wanted the jury to call the crime what it felt like to them, a brutal and intentional murder, but they also knew at least he was not walking away without punishment. Prosecutor Prem Burns admitted that the decision was frustrating, yet she also reminded everyone that the fight for justice had not been in vain, because Greg was still being held accountable. When the judge sentenced him, there was no mercy. Greg Harris was given 40 years at hard labor, the maximum allowed for manslaughter, with no chance of parole. His lawyers quickly began filing appeals, pointing again to the Duharts and to conflicts in the case. But the conviction stood And the legal chapter closed with Greg behind bars. Even after Greg Harris was sent away to serve a long sentence, the murder of Chiquita Tate has details that never seem to fully settle, leaving both investigators and the public with questions that hang in the air. One of the most troubling pieces is the male DNA found under Chiquita's fingernails, which showed she fought for her life, clawing at her attacker. But that DNA did not match Greg or any known person tied to the case. That means there could have been another individual at the crime scene, someone who slipped through the cracks, and that possibility keeps the doubts alive. There was also the matter of the strand of hair found clutched in Chiquita's hand, which experts said looked as if it had been cut cleanly with scissors, not ripped out during a violent fight. That left many wondering whether someone tried to stage the crime scene to mislead investigators, and if so, who was behind it. Even the city itself seemed to play a part, with downtown security cameras broken due to a storm weeks earlier, meaning one of the most brutal crimes Baton Rouge had ever seen went unwitnessed by the very eyes that might have answered everything. And because of that, the truth, while ruled on in court, still feels uncertain. Chiquita Tate's life was one of grit, determination, and dreams that were larger than the limits others tried to place on her. And when she walked into courtrooms, she carried not just her cases, but the hope of young lawyers who looked up to her. Her tragic death reminds us that even the strongest among us can fall victim to violence that comes from within their closest circle, where trust is supposed to live, but instead can turn into betrayal. If this story moved you and left you wanting to know more about the truths that hide behind crime and tragedy, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Your support is greatly appreciated. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next chapter.